The caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and it's, to me, has kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's really designed to be a very different experience compared to the rest of the game.
This for me is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do. And
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look from it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those, it's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself, but I think it is. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do, and you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things, that if a player does this, then this, and we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer or as a creative is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge number of them in the way that there might be with a very mechanically complex game, so you can really heavily focus on. What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life.
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little...
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you at this point in the game is kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island, and the idea that this kind of, again, the idea. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want